New and innovative QA technologies are rapidly changing the way companies release their products today. And to stay competitive, many teams are adopting new ways of testing that help them develop quality products faster. So I'm pleased to say today's webinar will focus on the top 5 trends in QA, from implementing CI/CD practices to successfully leveraging crowd testing QA platforms. That said, let me do a quick intro on our two speakers this morning. First speaker this morning is Fred Stevens Smith. Fred is the co-founder and CEO of Rainforest QA, and prior to that, he ran a successful web development agency and was CTO at Group 4, a digital marketing agency. Our next speaker is Russell. Russell is the co-founder and CTO of Rainforest QA and brings 10 years of experience running DevOps. Prior to this, he provided consultancy for startups and companies around development, ops, architecture design, and capacity planning. He specializes in development, developer workflow, DevOps, Linux, bug fixing, performance, scalability, ops planning, and modeling. That's it. I'll now turn the floor over to you, Fred. Take it away.
Cool. Hi, everyone. Really happy to be able to talk to you about top 5 trends in QA with my co-founder, Russ. And we think there should be some useful content here for you. So, first of all, continuous deployment. Right? Continuous deployment is the one that is probably the most important trend for everyone who works in QA, everyone who is building software to think about today. What are the key things about continuous deployment? Well, the key things are speed, right? Speed is basically the most important thing for continuous deployment. It's all about how do you get from the code being ready to go to production into production as quickly and automatically as possible. And so when we speak to CTOs, when we speak to VPs of engineering, when we speak to people who are deciding what to do with their development and deployment processes, every single person that we speak to is trying to get faster. Every single person. So I'm sure all of you have kind of seen this in your day-to-day lives, in your jobs. So what does it mean, right? Like, what does this mean for us as a QA team? Well, speed above all else basically means that the old way of doing QA no longer really works, right? Because we hear every single time we speak to a new customer, guys, we want to deploy faster, we want to deploy once a week or once a day or 10 times a day, but our QA is now a bottleneck. We don't have fast enough QA process to be able to deploy that frequently. And so companies are either deciding to deploy slower and continue doing a lot of rigorous QA, or they're just letting QA fall by the wayside. So what's clearly super important here is to automate everything, right? Everything to do with your deployment should be automated. Whether you're automating manual QA using Rainforest, whether you're writing Selenium, whether you're doing unit testing, or a combination of all of the above, all of these processes have to be kicked off automatically using an automated CD system. And basically, the ideal setup here is that you push a single button and, that's all you need to do to ship the code. The other kind of important thing to think about here is that this brings kind of the quality, usability, performance monitoring, all of these kind of, secondary kind of testing things, it brings them all into the release cycle. So what's important for us to consider is, as QA teams, is what that means for our day-to-day lives. And really what that means is that we have to get much more strategic as QA teams, right? Gone are the days where you can spend most of your time kind of bashing on websites and, giving kind of more subjective feedback to people. What's really important now is that you become much more strategic and think much more like a developer, right? So figure out how you can use frameworks and tools and programming languages to really improve your own leverage. And in general, we're seeing this as the big trend of this year in QA is this notion of shift left, right? So probably all of you have heard this. It's basically a buzzword, but it's actually kind of useful. And what it means is pushing QA closer and closer to where the code gets written. So rather than kind of the bad old days of QA where you would have, the QA team sitting just before production, and the QA team would basically be a gatekeeper. Now what people are realizing, and hopefully some of you are doing this, is that by involving the QA team and QA professionals earlier on, even to the point where the requirements and even the feature is being planned and the requirements are being written, by involving the QA that early in the process and by having kind of cross-functional teams that include QA, you can actually end up with a much more streamlined, much faster, much more efficient process that stops the kind of horrible blocking and kind of rewriting stuff that happens at the end. So, automation. Mr. Russell, do you want to take us through this?
Yeah. So one of the things well, most of you will have seen automation. So the whole general principle of this is it's a bucket of tools that you can use to make generally um, things, computer do something that you want. Some people refer to automation as like things like Selenium, which is one way of automating tests. Some people, like Fred was saying before, automation is part of CD. You have to automate your scripts to deploy to servers and set them up properly these days. No more people are just shipping stuff with FTP to a bunch of PHP scripts. It's not a thing anymore. Um, so
Well, it
the
shouldn't be a
it
thing.
shouldn't be a thing, but it still is. So like one of the biggest trends is to automate everything in the last 5 years. So there's a whole heap of tools. Like today, I'm actually at ChefConf. So Chef is a automation tool for doing server config management and server setup. There's other ones like that, and then in the QA space, there's things like Puppet, which are common for automation. Um, but the aim is for at least the QA related stuff, it changes the makeup of your QA team. So instead of having a bunch of people that run through scripts and write scripts, as in human read things in, say, Excel or a test case management system, you'd have QEs that write automation code. This then runs pretty fast, and you can even give to your devs with the whole shift left thing, and gives you some type of QA. So it gives you coverage of your code, which is kind of cool. The main reason for people using automation is, as Fred said, speed is one of the only things that you can do to fit into a CD or CI cycle that's acceptably fast. It has a bunch of pain points, bearing in mind that you have to hire engineers to write this stuff, and also it's relatively brittle, but generally it can be used pretty effectively. It just needs your team makeup to be changed if you've
And
got
so I think that's the really important thing, right? Like for the focus of this particular webinar, what we're talking about is how these trends will affect you as people doing QA teams, QA managers, CTOs, engineering groups. I think the key point about the move to automation across the industry, and as Russ has explained, we feel like that's mostly driven by the need for speed, right? The key thing about this is that the old way of QA is kind of dead, right? Where there are a lot of kind of manual checking, a lot of bashing on interfaces and applications. That's kind of fading away. And we're not saying that that doesn't have its use, right? High quality, high skilled, very knowledgeable exploratory testing is incredibly valuable, right? And we would never say to do without that. But one thing's for sure, in the kind of fight between speed and comprehensiveness, we've seen that speed wins every single time. And so I think that the smart thing to do as a forward-thinking QA team, a forward-thinking QA person, is to really try and understand what role will I play in the world, in the industry that we're in, when automation is the main kind of tool that QA teams have to use in order to deliver quality. And I think that what we've seen is that these teams are becoming much more leveraged, much more technical, much closer to engineering and product groups rather than, if nobody minds me saying this, kind of bad old world of QA, right? Where, this is what has given us a bad kind of image to the rest of the industry, right? That we're the guys and girls who are kind of sitting in the basement, doing all of the checking, doing really unskilled work and just telling them, no, you can't deploy. Right? Like no one wants to be those people. And so I think what's really important is to understand that the days of doing that are numbered, and as we move as an industry towards automation, it's super important that we as an industry recognize that we have to keep leveling up. And what we've seen is that the best QA folks, the best QA teams, they basically think of themselves much like developers do, right? Where developers tend to be obsessed with being on the cutting edge, and they're always playing around with new tools and new languages and new frameworks so that they can constantly inform themselves and be ahead of the curve. And what we've seen is that the really good QA teams are doing exactly the same thing, right? They have 20% time to dedicate towards
new projects, new automation. They're much more leveraged, and they think much more about how to use robots, how to use automation, how to use code to
Yeah,
increase their leverage.
it's much better ROI if they figure this out. And I think you're right. The best teams always do figure this out. However, even if they don't end up using Rainforest, there's many other ways of doing this that are smart modern ways of doing QA. I think, Fred, we need to move on to the next slide because otherwise we're going to run real late.
So B2B/enterprise buyers. I think the key thing about this, B2B product with B2C quality, well, what does that mean, first of all? Sorry for using all of this jargon. B2B business to business, B2C business to consumer, right? So, you know, a box versus a Facebook. So I think the key thing that we've seen here, and I'll keep this short, the key thing that we've seen here is that the enterprise consumer is more and more expecting a really high quality experience from their enterprise software. And so it used to be that as long as your enterprise software did something super useful, it could get away with being ugly, it could get away with being very hard and complicated to use, and it could get away with having a lot of bugs, frankly, right? The experience didn't have to be that polished. We all know what it feels like when a product feels super solid. So I think what's really interesting to us is that, you know, with the rise of kind of Apple over the last decade and the greater appreciation for design and for user interfaces across the entire kind of globe, what we've seen is that companies like Slack, companies like GitHub, you know, a few other companies, these guys are basically taking old school, clunky enterprise software and making it really sexy and polished and feel like a consumer app, right? When I'm chatting on Slack with my colleagues, it doesn't feel to me like I'm using enterprise communication tool. It feels like I'm just using, you know, like Snapchat, frankly.
It's super true. I think that it's super interesting that this is a trend, and like the one for me is that it's just become the bar to delivering software to people is now so low, like compared to say 10 years ago. Like anyone can just start a Roku app or AWS and ship something. So the bar for entry is super low, which means the quality's gone up, and i.e. the quality to differentiate yourself has gone up. And that's what you see with Slack. It's like, it's totally right. You can't ship crap anymore to people and have it be acceptable.
So for the QA teams, what does this mean? Like, what this means is that polish is really important. And so if we think about, you know, the hierarchy of needs of QA, where on the basic level we have everything functionally works, maybe one level above we have kind of cross-browser regressions, I think near the top is usability and polish, right? And so the expectation today of the enterprise consumer, and the place where frankly most of us spend most of our time as QA people and QA professionals, right, on software that customers pay a lot of money for and therefore have expectations of quality, they don't just expect everything to work now, they expect everything to be polished. And so what we're seeing is that QA teams are becoming much closer to kind of usability, product management type groups where they focus not just on does it work, but also does it work well, does it work nicely, is it intuitive? And we think these are key to the kind of modern QA process.
Yeah, totally right. Mobile's next, right? I think.
Mobile is up.
Yeah, so this is an interesting one because, like, for me, it's well, at the moment, everyone's aware that like you can't just CD, you can't continuously deliver mobile apps to people, and the main reason why the App Store approval times are generally like not super fast, you can't just ship it like a web app. That stuff's going down though, which is an interesting trend that is changing. But even with the times being super long like they are now, QA is so important for mobile because the cost of shipping a bug is so high. Because it's really difficult to reverse it or ship a patch. It takes too long, so you ship bad stuff to your users, and well, they're going to see it for quite a while, which is not good. So QA is so important in mobile dev now, and the tooling is super painful, mainly because of the amount of device fragmentation there is. Like Android, there's so many different types of devices and so many different versions. If you want to check everything, it's just a kind of a nightmare. It's similar on iOS, but less so, luckily. But yeah,
So,
we just
given that device fragmentation is the key problem to solve today for kind of native mobile QA, it's clear that over time that's probably going to be displaced as we get closer to continuous deployment on the mobile side. Can you talk a bit about that, Russ? Like, what will that mean for QA teams?
CD stuff. Well, I mean, CD will mean, I think it's actually interesting. It might actually make it less pressure to be 100% perfect and more pressure to, well, I believe it'll be less pressure to be 100% perfect when you QA stuff and way more pressure to speed up. That's my feeling on this. So as soon as we get App Store stuff that is either instantly approved or like within a few hours, that's going to be literally the case. Everyone's going to be rushing to get their builds done like in the sub-hour range. And today, from people I've talked to, they're still in the several days range at minimum for QAing mobile apps if they're doing it at all properly. So it's got to change quite a lot, which is interesting. So the only people I've seen managing to do QA really fast today is people that have invested in automation early. And the main reason they do that is they want to have a smaller QA team. And they want to have it closer to their developers with the shift left model. But I think that's going to become way, way more common, if not the standard, over the next, I think it's going to take 3 to 4 years to be in that you can ship stuff to the App Store in a couple of hours. I may be wrong.
Right, and to be clear, Russ is talking about purely mobile here. And I think one other thing that's worth kind of discussing on this slide is basically, there isn't a good solution today for mobile automation. Right, and so something that we've been very interested in, because of course we're a QA company, is how do our customers with their native mobile applications, how do they do QA? And the answer is very manually. So interestingly, perhaps to some of you guys, we actually just launched, I guess we haven't launched it, but we're gearing up to launch native mobile for Rainforest. We're calling it Rainforest Mobile. Rather uncreatively. We're gearing up to launch this Rainforest for precisely this reason, right? Because we've seen that the automation products fall really short. We've seen that device emulation is not good enough. And so Rainforest Mobile is basically Rainforest, so functional regression testing driven by a test suite that you control, but run against real devices. So yeah, that's something that we just launched, and I think it's very interesting to kind of consider how this is going to change over the next 3 or 4 years, as Russ has said. So finally, the changing role of QA. In many ways, we've talked about this for the entire kind of deck, but let's just kind of tie some things together. I think that what's really interesting about the changing role of QA, and I think, look, to kind of take a step back about QA in general, frankly, is that engineers, and especially engineering leaders, do not really have a strong handle on what great QA is and what modern QA feels like. And before anyone gets too offended, what I mean by that is if you go to your VP of engineering, your CTO, if you go to those guys or girls and say, hey, listen, what do you want from your continuous deployment system? What do you want from your source code repository? What do you want from your company chat? They're going to give you a pretty granular list of stuff that those tools should do. You go and ask them the same question about what do you want from your QA process. More often than not, you'll just get a vaguely blank look. And, the better prepared ones, and trust me, we speak to, maybe 100 of these type of people every month. So we have a pretty broad data set here. Even the best, most forward-thinking in terms of QA engineering leaders, they still don't really have a very strong idea of how QA should work, what QA should do, and who the people are that they should hire in order to do that. So something that we've seen is really interesting is that there is a lack of, thought leadership in the space of QA. And on top of that, this changing role of QA is leaving these eng leaders even more confused than they were before. And the very frequent question we get asked is, okay, so do I hire engineers to do automation? Should I hire manual checkers? Should I hire senior or junior people? Can't I just get an intern to do this? Can't the PMs just do this on the side? And what I think is fascinating is that, what we think is going to happen, and of course we think this is fascinating, what we think is going to happen, and we see the industry moving this way, is that QA is becoming much more strategic as a role. And so, just like we've seen on the customer success side, for example, the introduction of customer success ops, right, where customer success ops is a far more strategic and leveraged role, which feels much more perhaps like a DevOps, where most of their time is spent using infrastructure and figuring out how the workflow fits into the broader development workflow. We're expecting to see the rise of a role similar to QA ops over the next few years, where a significant chunk of QA being hired into really, really fast growing, kind of cutting edge technology companies. We expect the majority of those QA to be QA ops, right? Very strategic, very technical, focused on QA workflow and how that fits into the broader development and deployment workflow, rather than spending most of their time actually, doing testing or writing out test suites. And so we think this is incredibly interesting because none of us have any idea how this will change the industry that we all work in.
By the way, if you have any questions, there should be a form on the GoToWebinar thing. Feel free to submit something if you do have any questions you want answered, and we'll try and do them.
So I guess that takes us to the question section. So do we have any questions? If not, we have a couple of kind of preceded ones.
Yes.
They're not preceded, they're real ones.
Okay, so Fred, this question goes for you. You talked about all these trends, and as with all technology, the moment something's released, it's almost like it's obsolete. So how are these trends and technologies evolving?
It's a good question. I mean, basically right now, the industry is still stuck on an agile model, and the industry is slowly but surely moving towards continuous deployment. Now, is every single company, is Bank of America going to be deploying 100 times an hour? Probably never. But I think what's really kind of key to remember or key to understand is that every single software company in the world, we believe, within the next 5 years is going to be really focused on deploying as quickly as possible and as small chunks as possible. So I think that the evolution and the change that you're going to see in the industry is all towards speed. And so as that happens, that's going to make it harder and harder for the old model of QA to survive and thrive, and it's going to make it easier and easier and more fun if you're kind of like the new breed of QA. So for us, the lesson here is get on the kind of self-improvement train as quickly as possible.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like, I've not met anyone that doesn't believe that it's all about speed. I literally haven't met anyone. So I'd be interested to hear if anyone does know anyone that's on the other camp.
Great. So another question that's just come in is, so you talked a lot about the cutting-edge testing tools and techniques, and can you look at some of the experiences your customers have and tell us how can we build a QA strategy that effectively integrates cutting-edge testing tools and techniques?
Totally, yeah. I mean, this could be a very long answer, but in short, I think what we would suggest and what we've seen the best QA teams do is spend a lot of time thinking about workflow with your development and product teams. So great QA is collaborative, and I think that where we're at as an industry today, in large part, and let's be real, everybody, like QA has a shitty reputation. And I don't know that that's deserved, and we don't kind of think that QA is evil, but we have seen in every single customer we've been into, the QA team is usually seen as kind of second-class citizens. And like that's the elephant in the room here, right? Like let's not beat around the bush. This is something that all of you have to contend with every single day. And so the big reason that we believe this is the status quo is because QA has been a silo. QA strategies, processes, teams have been created without talking to product, without talking to dev about what they actually need from the process. So my kind of quick and dirty recommendations would be get the key stakeholders from engineering and product and QA all in the same room and figure out what is our focus. We believe it's going to tend to be speed, but that might be different for your company. Once you have that focus figured out, the next step is to figure out where do we want QA to live and what do we want QA to do. And I think that the super key thing is to have buy-in from the product, the engineering, and the QA side so that you're all aligned on what you guys deliver. From there, you build your strategy, right? So, you know, once you have that idea of where you sit in the workflow, okay, we're going to do, you know, regression, functional regression, cross-browser testing just before production. We're also going to do that on our feature branches. We are going to have QA involved in the requirements and iteration process during dev, and those are going to be our kind of 3 touch points, right? So once you've figured out workflow and where you guys, like what your organization wants from QA, then you build a strategy, and the strategy can be nice and crisp and succinct, and from there you figure out, all right, what are the best tools and what is the best approaches for us to fit into this whole strategy. So I would think about it very logically, very step by step, and start from what the organization wants from QA, right? That's how I would go about it.
Fred?
Yeah, good. I think we have one more question.
Actually a couple more. So the next question is, Russ, why don't you take a stab at this first and see, and then Fred, you can chime in. Do you see any trends in the enterprise companies using crowdsourced testing? You know, companies particularly like SAP and Oracle apps.
I haven't actually seen any trends in them using that. No, I think they want to, as in they want to move faster, but I've not actually seen trends in using that yet. Fred, have you seen that?
Yes, and this is where Russ not being on the customer side shines through. So yeah, absolutely, of course we have, and you know, some of our customers, you know, we've got IBM, Oracle, a few other really large enterprises, Intuit, using Rainforest to do precisely this. Now, you know, the obvious concern with crowd testing is kind of security and which eyeballs are kind of on your interfaces, right? And so that is typically the big concern for engineering leaders, for QA teams. So something that we found really, really helpful, you know, what we do for those customers, we have a kind of feature which we call OnPremise Crowd. And so this is basically very analogous to like an on-premise cloud with an L, where you can have kind of like some of your assets living in AWS, some of them on your own servers, and you have this kind of hybrid situation where you use, you know, whichever cloud, so to speak, is most suitable. So Rainforest has exactly the same thing, where you can run a portion of your test cases against our global crowd, and then you can choose to run some more sensitive test cases against an internal testing crowd. And so, you know, what we're seeing is that much like with infrastructure, you know, where people started out saying, I will never, ever host my application on AWS's servers unless it's inside my firewall, you know, over time, people kind of get over that and they realize, actually, look, the benefits outweigh the costs here. So we see a slow but steady move on the enterprise side towards crowdsourced QA for the same reason the rest of the industry is kind of adopting it, which is that it's cheaper and faster. So absolutely, and as you know, the industry opens up and as more companies adopt our model of having a kind of hybrid, you know, kind of public-private crowd thing, we think that there's going to be really significant adoption over the next kind of 5 years.
Great answer, Fred, and that's why you're on that side of the business. So we have a question. So which QA tools will dominate the space? From I can't remember his name. Okay, cool. So which QA tools will dominate the QA market in the future was the question.
Well, I think, you know, how we think about it is we think about QA as kind of 3 pillars, right? Test case management, reporting, and execution. I think our rough take on it is that test case management is essentially commoditized. You know, there's tens, if not hundreds, of different test case management tools. You know, most of them at this point are pretty good. You know, one is much like the other, and basically whichever your you're most familiar with is the right one for you. So, it's pretty hard to go wrong there. And for that reason, we don't see any clear market leader because there's no real differentiation. On the reporting side, we think that there's huge opportunity here. Reporting as in, what is the quality of your application today? There's no single pane of glass that works really well, right? Like, for example, like a New Relic, right? About this is the kind of quality of your application in production. There's nothing like that in dev today. So we don't know. We've seen some interesting approaches. None of them look mature enough to potentially be a market leader. So that would be kind of jumping the gun. And then I think the final point here is execution, right? So execution of test cases, understanding whether things actually work or not. That's a hugely differentiated space. Today, that's basically either humans or Rainforest. And, I bucket kind of automated testing under humans because you still need to have humans write and maintain those test scripts. I think that we have Rainforest has a decent chance of becoming the kind of market leader on the execution side. Outside of that, obviously Selenium and frankly manual testing are really the kind of leaders today. And yeah, it remains to be seen. What we're really excited about is, and I think in part kind of incentivized by all of the noise that we've been making in the space, there's been a few new kind of early stage companies coming out, Teslio is one that comes to mind, in the space, and starting to do some really cool innovative things. And so we're really, really excited for the space to hot up over the next 5 or so years, and you guys will be the recipients of a lot more innovation. And frankly, the market leaders in QA today are very old and tired, right? I'm thinking about HP, I'm thinking about Microsoft, I'm thinking about, IBM. These guys are not innovating, right? They're selling the same old software that everyone knows and doesn't really do very much interesting. And so, to be honest, the answer to your question is like none of the current players, except of course maybe Rainforest, and a bunch new exciting technology to come over the next few years.
Thank you, Fred. So this actually brings us to the end of our time with everyone. I want to take this opportunity to thank both you, Fred, and Russ for your time and sharing your thoughts and trends about the QA space. I think it was very informative. I'm sure everybody on the line found this as well. I do want to take this opportunity to wrap up and conclude that this ends our webcast today. Thank you for everyone, and if you'd like to learn more about Rainforest QA and how we can help scale your QA organization without having to scale your QA resources, please visit our website at rainforestqa.com or follow us on Twitter at rainforestqa. This concludes the audio portion of our event today. Thank you, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks, guys.